I think one of the things that folks don't necessarily think about in the day-to-day is how many of us, how many of our neighbors, how many potentially of our coworkers, teachers are either housing insecure or potentially on the brink of losing their home. When you think about in the United States, how many people are living paycheck to paycheck and don't have the savings to withstand a financial shock, that number is close to 50%.
This is Hourglass, the podcast for United Way of King County in Seattle. Coming up, the first podcast in our series that highlights members of United Way of King County's Board of Directors. We'll spotlight United Way board member Shkëlqim Kelmendi of Housing Connector, a Seattle-based organization that increases affordable housing access for those in need by addressing financial and residency challenges. We'll also talk about our upcoming rapid response grants and discuss a local volunteer opportunity. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for tuning in. Most nonprofit organizations are as strong and successful as their boards of directors, and United Way of King County is no exception. We have a volunteer board made up of people who work and reside in King County that bring knowledge of community issues and insight from their respective sectors. This podcast is the first in a series highlighting members of United Way of King County's board, which comprises more than 36 people from corporate, nonprofit, education, media, and service fields. The first board member we'll profile is Shkëlqim Kelmendi, the founder and executive director of Housing Connector, a Seattle-based organization that partners with property owners and managers to increase access to affordable housing for those in need by addressing financial and residency challenges. Since its launch in 2019, Housing Connector has partnered with more than 750 properties and 75 service providers to house more than 7,000 people. In addition to Washington State, Housing Connector has branched out to Denver, Portland, and Dallas, where Shkëlqim grew up. Originally from Kosovo, Shkëlqim immigrated to the United States with his family as refugees in 1999 following the Kosovo War. He says his experience growing up in a society torn by war and navigating a new country has fueled his commitment to serving his community. United Way sat down with Shkëlqim last year to discuss his Kosovo background, his assimilation into American life, and his commitment to addressing our local housing crisis. Here's what he had to say.
I was born in Kosovo, which is a small country in Eastern Europe in the 90s. And for folks that don't know, at that time, Kosovo was really going through a significant transition. Albanian Kosovars, which is what I am, at that time were being persecuted. And so my whole childhood was really kind of spent going from one place to another, oftentimes in hiding. And things eventually really escalated to full-out war in the late 90s. During that time, my family was heavily involved in the resistance movement. And so it was an interesting childhood because while my parents did an amazing job protecting my siblings and I, it was also a very difficult one. Eventually, once things escalated to the point where we could not even be in our home, we fled the country. We jumped actually on a train that we didn't know where it was going, but we were kind of ushered that way by Serbian police. We jumped on this train and it took us on the border of Kosovo and Macedonia. And we slept on a field outside for about 5 days and 5 nights. And we couldn't get into Macedonia. We couldn't go back into Kosovo. And thousands of people were just out in this open field. And when, I think about that time, which I didn't appreciate as a young kid, but now actually having 2 kids of my own, is I remember sleeping on my parents' chest while they slept on the bare ground. And I think about that now as a parent and trying to think about how they did that. And I truly can't imagine it. But, eventually we were fortunate. We got into Macedonia. We bounced around different refugee camps. And eventually we won the golden ticket, which is we had the ability to come to the U.S. As refugees. And really, I do consider that the golden ticket. And in a lot of ways, that was the path that allowed our family a chance out of that difficult situation, a chance to access education, and now a chance for me to give back to others, and hopefully help invest in other families' lives the way that people invested in my family when we moved to the U.S.
Okay. And so can you talk a little bit about some of your first experiences with this country? Where did you arrive and sort of the pathway? You mentioned Dallas. So where did you arrive? And then sort of your pathway to get to Dallas to where you are here now.
Yeah. So when we first moved to the U.S., we came and we were relocated to Dallas. Now, look, I knew nothing about Dallas except for the TV show Dallas.
Oh, wow.
So I expected everyone to be wearing cowboy hats and riding on horses, which that was not completely true, although parts of Fort Worth were true. And I think it's an interesting thing. There's some things as a child that I remember when I came here were first how big the overpasses are in Dallas.
Oh, wow.
And I'd never seen anything that tall. You know, at that point in Kosovo, I think the tallest building I'd ever seen was maybe like 10 stories.
Okay.
And you have overpasses in Dallas that are, feel like 20, 30 stories high. And so I do remember that. I think the other thing I remember is the first apartment we lived in was in a heavily Hispanic concentrated neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
And at that time, we didn't speak English. And I think my first year in America, I learned more Spanish than English.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know the difference. So I didn't realize I was actually learning Spanish instead of English because to me, it was just all foreign and different.
Right.
But eventually, my parents moved outside of the downtown Dallas area. We moved to a suburb, mostly to just try to access a different school system. Mm-hmm. Just like any immigrant kid, for them, it was all about education. Fast forward, I ended up going to school in the Dallas area at Southern Methodist University.
SMU?
Yeah, SMU, Caponia. And then eventually stayed in Dallas for a little bit and worked at the Federal Reserve. And then finally, my partner and I decided to move out to Seattle. And, part of it was honestly to escape the heat in Dallas. But part of it was really also access to the outdoors, which Seattle just has so much to offer in that regards.
And so now, from the time that you were in Dallas and to the time that you're now here, what really gravitated you? You talk about giving back.
Yeah.
What gravitated you toward housing?
So here's the thing. I am not a housing expert. Mm-hmm. And I will say housing isn't necessarily even my passion, which I'm hesitant to tell people that. What I've always really cared about is more problems.
Right.
And the reason I gravitated towards housing was really because when I came to Seattle, the problem that was so in everyone's face and it was so evident was our homelessness crisis. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't walk down a street in Seattle without seeing the difficulties and the challenges that our neighbors were having, our unhoused neighbors were having. And to me, when I saw that, I said, this is something I want to do. I want to do something about this. And that's why I gravitated. And I kind of just got myself into that field, worked at the Seattle Housing Authority for a bit and really learned about the problem. And eventually from there started Housing Connector to try to address a very specific subset of our housing and homelessness crisis.
And so while you were at the Seattle Housing Authority, what did you learn about the problem?
First of all, I learned about how much bigger it is than I thought.
Okay.
I think one of the things that folks don't necessarily think about in the day-to-day is how many of us, how many of our neighbors, how many potentially of our coworkers, teachers are either housing insecure or potentially on the brink of losing their home. When you think about in the United States, how many people are living paycheck to paycheck and don't have the savings to withstand a financial shock, that number is close to 50%. And that's something that I think in the day-to-day, like I lived that. That was my story. That was my family. But I assume that everyone else or most other people and families were way better off.
Sure.
And it was a real realization of like, wow, this is not only a huge problem when it comes to our homelessness crisis, but there's a huge problem of how many people and families are on the brink of falling into that crisis that is often not talked about because it's not visible.
Right. And it's interesting now because when I do go overseas, I see a housing crisis. I never forget, I've only been to Brussels one time. I went via train, and as soon as you walk out of the train station, there are people sleeping on bedroom mattresses. And I just never thought I would see it. I've seen it in Cape Town. And I think there's so many folks, particularly here, that think it's a Seattle problem, a King County problem. But it really seems like, even when I go to Canada, it seems like it is a global epidemic, a global crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, because I can't speak as well on the global piece. I will say that it is definitely a national problem for us. Mm-hmm. It's not a even West Coast problem or a Seattle problem. I think, to your point, if you go to Vancouver, maybe you don't see it at the same scale because they might have different safety nets, but nonetheless, it's there. And it's a puzzling thing when we think about how much wealth, these countries, especially Western countries, have, and to think about how many people are being left behind. That's something that's always puzzling. And I will say my parents still live in Kosovo. And when they came and visited a couple of years ago here in Seattle, they couldn't believe it.
Wow.
They couldn't believe that there are people in America that are literally sleeping on the street. And I think, again, that's where, when you go outside of America, there is this perception that a lot of, especially developing countries, have of the United States.
Absolutely.
Of the wealth and the prosperity. And then when they come and see how many folks here are not just barely making it, but are deeply struggling and in crisis. And I think people are puzzled by that.
How do you make that make sense to them?
It's really hard. So I think I try to explain, like, welcome to capitalism, welcome to how things work as far as like the lack of safety nets and the lack of traditional safety nets. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of cultures, your safety net is your family.
Right.
And so when you think about, a lot of ways in America where we have it more of a individual system, and a lot of folks aren't necessarily as close-knit. And again, this is a generalization,
right.
But maybe in comparison to other countries. I think what I tell them is like, look, this happens in our country. This happens in Kosovo, but when somebody loses their job or can't pay rent, their whole family steps in and either takes them in or supports them. And there's an aspect of family pride there. There's an aspect of honor that you would never allow somebody in your family to be on the street.
Right.
And for so many folks here, they don't have that. Right. And I'm not here to say why they don't have it, but that safety net might not be there. And therefore, who are they going to call on? Who's going to step in? Who's their big brother? Who's their big sister that can step in? And maybe that person just isn't there in their lives.
So now, once you decided to make this your means of helping and making a difference, how did you get it from the idea to the concept to what you have now with Housing Connector?
Yeah, I think one of the things we talk about actually at Housing Connector, one of our principles is launch before you're ready.
Okay.
And so the idea is, if you're not embarrassed by your first product or your first version, you've waited too long. And this is taking on from a quote that I think the LinkedIn founder had. And it was really, that was part of our goal when we started Housing Connector. It was, we have this idea, and the idea was simple. We are seeing folks being denied housing because of their barriers like credit score or past eviction or criminal history. And that is exasperating the problem, because folks that could be in housing today and could access the units that are there are not because of these barriers. And so we said, okay, let's just start testing this theory out and, be scientists. Let's go, try this out and test this hypothesis of whether it's true. And so we found a partner, a property, and we said, look, we will basically cover all your costs if this doesn't go well.
Wow.
And all we need is you to take a chance and give us a couple of units so we can test this out. And I think that experiment that I'll call cost us about $15,000 because we didn't have it all figured out. But it was the best $15,000 we've ever invested at this company, because we learned so much in those first 5 households that we connected to housing. We learned so much about how to communicate with the property industry, what we're trying to do and how we can add value, how we can better understand their businesses. And then ultimately, we were able to use those early results and go to the next potential partner and say, hey, you're not the first one.
Right.
Because oftentimes nobody wants to be the first one to take a chance. And so that's kind of how we took it from idea quickly to testing it out and then just iterating, figuring out what was working, what didn't work, and then just continuing to evolve. And, in the last 4.5 years since we started this, we went from those first 5 households to now where we've housed over 7,000 people.
Over 7,000 people. What are some other milestones that you've seen?
Yeah. Well, I would say there's 2 parts here, right? There's the milestones that I think about in terms of impact and where the organization is. And some of those include us testing it in Seattle and then scaling it. And then the other thing that was always important to me was thinking about, again, how do we design a solution where the scale of the solution matches the scale of the problem? And so part of that meant we have to have a solution that can go national.
Okay.
Right? You can debate, was that but that was our vision for it. And so I would say the other big milestone for us was when we were able to replicate our impact here in Washington. We were able to replicate that in Colorado, and then in Texas, in Dallas, and now most recently in Portland. And I think that was a huge one. But the other milestones that I think about is really more around the team and the people that we have at this organization. And I think about a few years ago, Housing Connector was named as one of the best 5 companies to work for in the state of Washington. And that was because of the input and the feedback of our team and my colleagues. And that's something that I'm really proud of because, again, I think we've tried to build a company and a culture that not only is doing good and making an impact, but it's also a place that people feel like they belong, that people have that freedom and that flexibility to bring their true selves and be able to make an impact while being surrounded by passionate people that care about each other.
Great. So now, as you think about some of the stories of people who you've helped that made you say, you know what, this is why we do this, what would it be?
The one that immediately comes to mind is there was a single father with 2 kids here in Seattle. And he was working, but had a criminal history in his past. And he was struggling to find housing in the catchment area in the district where his kids went to school. And he didn't want to disrupt their education and their school. And so they were sleeping in their car so the kids could continue going to that school.
Wow.
And then he was going to work. He was finding ways to get, showers, get access for the kids. And for us, what we were able to do, with his father and his family is we were able to very quickly find him an apartment that said, we're going to waive those criminal barriers and we're going to get you connected to a unit today. And it was in the school district, so his kids didn't have to change schools. Their education wasn't impacted. And that was something that was able to happen in the matter of days once we got connected to this individual. And I think about that because, one, when we think about homelessness, I think the picture we have in our mind is either a tent or somebody on the side of the street.
Right.
But what a lot of people don't think about is the thousands of people and families that are doing everything possible. They don't want to be seen. If you think about especially a parent, the risks of people knowing that you might be homeless, potentially your children being taken away. And so those folks that are unseen but struggling, and for us to be able to reach them, that's something that sticks with me. Another one more recent is a teacher that we were able to house in Dallas and get connected. And this is, again, somebody teaching in the school district. And something that she said that, resonates in this anecdote, she told our team, it's interesting that people are okay with me teaching their kids, but they're not okay with me living in their building. And I was like, yeah, that's messed up, right? But that's the society and that's the system we have where we trust our teachers to teach our kids, arguably the most valuable thing that, a lot of us may consider in our lives. And yet we wouldn't feel comfortable living next to them, or at least that's what those screening criteria and the systems are resulting in.
And can you just talk about just how you have been able, and again, you just mentioned it, how have been some of the ways that you have stirred up hope in a lot of the people that you've helped? Because, I talk to some folks and, you always hear people say, well, if you gave them housing, but they get turned away so often to some of them end up saying, what's the use? How do you stir hope and keep people thinking that if they try hard enough that they will get housed?
Yeah. Well, we have hope is often the last thing that goes. in my opinion. And so when you see somebody that has lost hope, first of all, I have so much empathy because I can just imagine the challenges and the obstacles and the no's that they've gotten to get to that point where they feel like it's hopeless. I think for us, the only way that I can think of infusing and bringing back hope for people is showing them tangible results and showing them that things can be different. And that means not saying things are going to be different, but actually showing them. And I'll give you an example. One of the individuals we connected to housing early on, his name was Chauncey. He had been denied over 20 times. Over 20 times. And his case manager went to him and said, "Hey, Chauncey, I think I found a unit through this group called Housing Connect." And we had a story with him, and he said, when she said that to him, he said, "I don't believe you.
Yeah.
I've been told that before." And then he applied to that unit through Housing Connector and was accepted immediately. And he didn't believe it until he got his keys and was able to move into, and for him, that went from feeling hopeless to getting keys and seeing that there is hope, that there is a pathway. And for us, as I think about our team, how do we make sure that we don't get discouraged given the scale of this problem?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's honestly, I think one of the issues we have is when we start talking about numbers like there's 650,000 people experiencing homelessness, there's 24 million people that are housing insecure. We're getting to numbers that make it so difficult for people to even comprehend that oftentimes we almost want to disengage. And so for us, the way with our team we think about is remembering those stories, remembering those names, and realizing that, yes, we have connected 7,000 people, but that's 7,000 lives. That's 7,000 stories that are unique, just like Chauncey's was.
Great.
And remembering that in the many, to not lose sight of the individual, of the one, and realizing that every time we get somebody a key, every time we open a door for somebody, that is a potential life-changing event. And that is what gives me hope. That is what I think gives our team hope and allows us to keep doing it.
We at United Way really stress prevention.
Yeah.
That one of the biggest keys is to keep people from being unhoused and in the first place, keeping them housed. How do you get people to buy into prevention, particularly when they can go outside and see that there are people out there that need to be housed?
Yeah, I think oftentimes what people say is prevention doesn't sell.
Right.
But the thing is, prevention is better than the cure.
Yeah.
The way I've been trying to communicate this with folks, because I fully believe that prevention is the way to go for a number of reasons. And we can talk about that from a financial perspective, from a humanitarian perspective of preventing the trauma that's caused when somebody loses their housing. But I've tried to connect it to something that maybe is more tangible for people.
Yeah.
And the one area that I think most of us get it is when it comes to our health. And, right, the saying often goes is you don't appreciate your health until it's gone.
Right.
And I think oftentimes that's how we think about, I think that's how housing is. And so what I've been telling people, especially recently, is look, the homelessness system is the emergency room. What we need to do as a society, as a community, as individuals, is think about how do we identify what the primary care doctor is, who the primary care doctor is for our housing crisis.
Yeah.
And how do we go further upstream so folks never touch the emergency room? Folks are never interacting with the homelessness system.
Right.
And what that requires is new ways of thinking, and it requires new mechanisms for getting upstream data and information that signals that somebody may be heading down that path. And that's what's difficult when we talk about prevention is how do you know somebody might be on the verge of losing their housing?
Right.
And then folks, I think oftentimes will be like, well, but are you sure that they were going to be homeless? Are you sure that was the best investment? And my response is of course I'm not sure. But all the indicators are that this person was heading down that path, and us stepping in with a small intervention, financial or just connection, is going to ensure that they have that stability and reduces the likelihood that they were going down that path. So who gives a crap if somebody that was already low income is getting access to resources?
Right.
That is still a benefit that's still providing them stability. So yeah, I think this is something that we need to just change the narrative and get more people talking about, because as you mentioned, it's the only way we're going to solve this. We've got to stop the inflow into homelessness because just focusing on the outflow, the exit, is not going to be enough.
Great. And lastly, for someone who hears this and they are possibly experiencing homelessness, possibly on the verge of eviction, if they know someone who is or has or is who could benefit from Housing Connector, what would you say?
Yeah, first of all, I would say, you can go to our website, housingconnector.com, and then get connected, get information. One of the things we would do is also try to connect folks to resources in the community, whether it's case managers. Obviously, there's groups like United Way that have support. And I think the challenge is the need is right now outweighing the resources that are there. But for anyone that knows somebody that is struggling, for anyone that may be struggling themselves, I would say realizing that there are resources out there that you can reach out to our team, and then we can work to connect you to those resources, connect you to housing, and find you a pathway to hopefully finding that hope again if it's not there. And with that hope, also some permanent and stable housing.
Perfect. Shkëlqim, thank you so much. And thank you for Housing Connector for the fantastic work that you all do.
I appreciate you having me on.
For more information about Housing Connector, log on to housingconnector.com. The results of the 2024 general election have United Way and other organizations concerned for communities of color, which were often the subject of harmful rhetoric spewed by candidates during campaigns. Those communities stand to bear the brunt of harmful legislation that often targets those without power. We believe that it is our duty to let those communities know that we see them, we support them, and that we are willing to act on their behalf with resources and advocacy. That is why in 2025, United Way of King County will add rapid response grants as a component to the Our Neighbor Fund. Rapid response grants will help United Way address the urgent challenges our communities face by enabling us to meet emergent needs swiftly and effectively while ensuring long-term impact. This approach reflects our steadfast commitment to the values of equity and justice. Stay tuned for more information about our rapid response grants. And to support our Neighbor Fund, log on to uwkc.org/donate. Looking for a volunteer opportunity? Consider Rainier Athletes, a long-term mentoring organization that works with students and their families from 4th grade through high school graduation and beyond. And don't let the name deceive you. No experience in sports is required for volunteering at Rainier Athletes, which draws mentees who are interested in sports, as well as the arts, activism, and the sciences. Volunteer mentors typically spend 1 hour per week meeting with students and communicating with students' parents, teachers, coaches, and others. Rainier Athletes asks mentors to commit at least 1 full school year to the program. For more information, log on to rainierathletes.org. At United Way of King County, we are working side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. Hourglass United Way is a podcast that highlights how we and our partners spend time making a difference in our communities. Our work is made possible by the generous donations from people like you. Please send comments and suggestions about our podcast to hourglassunitedway@gmail.com. To learn more about our work or to support United Way, log on to uwkc.org. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for listening. Until next time.